In the sky above the clouds, aboard one of the most secure aircrafts in the world, a moment unfolded that no camera was meant to catch, no headlines were supposed to capture. But what happened mid-flight on Air Force One would go on to challenge not just protocol, but the very definition of duty and power in America. This is not a dramatization. It's a real account of a confrontation between a former U.S. president and the Air Force pilot who refused his direct order, at 30,000 feet. In a world where authority often goes unchecked and integrity is quietly sacrificed, one man made a choice that would shake the corridors of Washington, ignite a media storm, and redefine what it means to say no when it matters most. Stay with us as we unpack the gripping story of Captain Jonathan Rhodes, the pilot who stood his ground, and the hidden truths behind a flight that almost never reached its destination. The steady hum of Air Force One echoed through the cabin like the pulse of a living creature. The vast expanse of the aircraft was filled with a quiet, almost eerie calm, broken only by the occasional sound of papers rustling or soft murmurs from staff moving through the aisles. But this was no ordinary flight. This was a plane carrying one of the most powerful men in the world, former President Richard Grant, and today, something in the air felt different. Grant sat alone in his plush leather seat, the large windows on either side offering a view of the endless stretch of sky below. He was supposed to be preparing for the political fundraiser waiting for him in Texas, a crucial event meant to energize his next political move. Yet his eyes flickered over the in-flight briefings on his lap, barely taking in the words. His mind was elsewhere, turbulent, uneasy. The muted voices of Fox News played in the background, but even their familiar chatter couldn't ground him. His jaw tightened. He set the papers aside and reached for the secure satellite phone by his side. His fingers gripped the cold plastic with uncharacteristic urgency. Something had changed. Something was brewing beneath the surface, and it had nothing to do with the well-planned event ahead. He dialed a number, his eyes narrowing, focusing on something invisible outside the windows. "Where's Captain Rhodes?" he barked into the phone, the command sharp and uncompromising. The aide on the other end didn't need to be told twice. In the world of politics and power, when the president, or former president, in this case, gave an order like that, it wasn't a request, it was a directive. Without a word, the aide relayed the message. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Time stretched thin as Grant's fingers drummed against the armrest, a quiet, rhythmic tick-tock of impatience. The cabin door opened, and the familiar, grounded figure of Captain Jonathan Rhodes entered the suite. Tall, unflinching, and dressed in the sharp blue uniform of the Air Force, Rhodes had earned the respect of not only his colleagues but of every administration he'd served under. A man of unwavering discipline, whose calm demeanor contrasted with the turbulence of the world around him. Rhodes stood at attention, his face unreadable. "You called for me, Mr. President?" Grant didn't stand or offer the kind of greeting one might expect from a man of his stature. Instead, he leaned forward, his eyes burning with an intensity that could cut through steel. There was a sharpness in his voice when he spoke, a tension that had been building beneath the surface. "We're not going to Texas, Captain," he said, his words deliberate and final. "I need this plane rerouted. We're going to Charlotte, North Carolina. There's someone there I need to meet. It's urgent." Rhodes blinked once, his expression unreadable, but the slight crease of his brow told the story. This wasn't just a change of flight plans. This was an order that didn't make sense, not at this stage of the journey, not without proper clearance. The flight plan had been set weeks in advance, carefully coordinated with military and civilian authorities. There was no room for deviation. And yet here it was, a direct order that could potentially compromise everything. "Sir," Rhodes said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of unspoken protocol, "the flight plan has been cleared with multiple agencies. Any change, especially at this altitude, requires immediate coordination with NORAD, the FAA, the Secret Service. I don't care about any of that. Grant interrupted, his voice rising with anger, the control he usually exuded slipping. You have the coordinates. You'll do it. I'm not asking. For a moment, the room seemed to freeze. The air felt thicker now, every word between them a potential flashpoint. Grant's face was flushed, the anger palpable. He was the former president, a man who had commanded respect in every room he'd entered. And yet, here he was, in the air, demanding something that didn't make sense. Rhodes stood there, unshaken. His hands were clasped behind his back, his posture perfect. His eyes remained fixed ahead, not wavering in the face of the former president's fury. There was no fear in Rhodes, only a quiet resolve, a resolve forged in years of following orders, of knowing what was right and what was wrong, regardless of rank or position. I'm afraid I can't comply with that order, Mr. President, Rhodes said, his voice firm but respectful. Mid-flight rerouting without proper clearance violates protocol, and it jeopardizes the safety and security of the aircraft, its crew, and the people on board. I cannot and will not risk national security for a personal request. Grant's eyes narrowed, disbelief crossing his features. You're refusing me? His voice was sharp, rising with incredulity, as if the idea that anyone would dare defy him was foreign to his understanding. I'm not refusing you, sir, Rhodes said calmly. I'm following my duty. I serve the office, not the man. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, resonating with a weight that neither man had expected. For a brief moment, time seemed to stop. Grant's face twisted in rage, his red-faced anger rising with each passing second. The room crackled with tension. He was used to being in control, used to people falling in line. But here, in the sky, with nothing but miles of clouds beneath them, his authority meant nothing. Rhodes stood still, unflinching. The walls of Air Force One could hear the shouts, the demands, the threats. But Rhodes didn't move, didn't flinch. His voice remained the same, calm, controlled, unwavering. Grant's frustration boiled over, and in a fury of words, he ordered the staff to get military officials on the phone, to fire this man right now. But still, Captain Rhodes did not move. He did not raise his voice. He did not break. The conflict between them was now in full force, a clash of power, integrity, and duty. Outside, the world continued on, unaware of the silent battle unfolding in the sky. The silence that followed the confrontation felt deafening. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the weight of the unsaid, the tension that hung thick in the air like smoke in a room you couldn't escape. Captain Jonathan Rhodes stood perfectly still, his back straight, hands clasped behind him, the picture of professionalism. But inside, his heart was pounding. He had just made a decision that could alter the course of not only this flight but also his entire career. A decision that went against the very man who had once held the power to decide his fate. President Grant stood across from him, his face flushed with fury. His hands were trembling slightly, but whether it was from rage or the frustration of having been denied, it was hard to tell. The once polished and collected leader was now unraveling, his facade cracking as the magnitude of the situation settled in. This was not how things were supposed to unfold. He had been in control, he had always been in control. Yet here, in the confined space of this aircraft, his power was limited, diminished, and a sharp pang of vulnerability coursed through him. Grant's eyes narrowed, his gaze piercing as he leaned forward, his words cutting through the air. You can't do this to me. You can't just refuse my orders, Rhodes. Do you know who I am? Do you understand what's at stake here? His voice trembled slightly, though he tried to disguise it with an air of authority. His frustration was spilling over, raw and untamed. This isn't just about following orders, it's about securing the future, mine and this country's. You have to trust me. Captain Rhodes, however, remained unmoved. His expression was calm, even distant, but underneath the mask of professionalism, a storm was brewing. Every fiber of his being screamed to stand his ground. He had spent years in the service of the United States, adhering to codes of honor and duty, and now, in this moment, he was being asked to compromise everything he believed in for a whim. But it wasn't just about protocol, it was about something deeper. Something he couldn't quite put into words. He wasn't sure if it was instinct or the weight of his training, but the answer was simple: no. I'm afraid I can't comply, Mr. President, Rhodes said, his voice steady but firm, his hands still at his sides, never wavering. Unauthorized deviations from flight plans without proper clearance are against protocol. It's a matter of national security. You're asking me to risk everything, this plane, this crew, and the safety of everyone on board, for something that doesn't have proper clearance. Grant's jaw clenched, his knuckles turning white as his fists tightened in frustration. The reality of what was happening, of being denied in such an unexpected and public way, was sinking in. It was a humiliation he hadn't experienced in decades. His thoughts raced, his mind grappling with the fact that Rhodes, of all people, had the gall to challenge him in front of everyone. The other passengers, the crew, the Secret Service agents, all had heard him refuse. It was an unprecedented act of insubordination. For a brief moment, the words froze in Grant's throat. He had never been told no, not like this. Not in such a direct, resolute way. The reality of it was starting to sting, like a slap across the face. His eyes flared, and he opened his mouth to shout something, anything, to regain control of the situation. But then the quiet, calm voice of Captain Rhodes cut through the noise again. Mr. President, I serve the office of the President, not the man, Rhodes said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. It wasn't a defiance born from rebellion, it was simply a truth he had to live by. A truth he was bound to, no matter the personal cost. Grant's face reddened with rage. You're making a huge mistake, Rhodes. This will not end well for you. Rhodes didn't flinch. He didn't rise to the bait. He simply stood there, rooted in place, the embodiment of calm amid a storm. The words from Grant seemed distant, hollow even. He had made his decision, and there was nothing the president could say that would change it now. He was unwavering, his focus clear. In the span of a few heartbeats, the tension in the cabin reached its peak. Grant's voice rose, sharp and brittle with fury. I want this man fired right now, he demanded, his eyes flashing as he turned to his aides, his voice echoing in the confined space of the cabin. But Rhodes didn't budge. He didn't raise his voice, didn't argue. He simply replied, this plane belongs to the United States government. I cannot and will not risk the lives of everyone on board for an unauthorized personal detour. The words landed like a slap, hard and undeniable. And for a moment, Grant stood there, staring at Rhodes, his chest heaving with frustration. The President of the United States, the man who had commanded armies, directed nations, and shaped history, was now powerless in this moment. He was at the mercy of this man, the one person who had the courage, the integrity, and the discipline to stand against him. As the tension between them lingered, Grant took a step back, his mind spinning. He knew Rhodes was right, of course. He had always known that in the world of politics, there were lines you could not cross. But in the chaos of his own mind, Grant couldn't see the lines anymore. All he saw was the need to regain control, to manipulate the narrative, to keep everything in motion. He was trapped in a place of his own making. But it wasn't just about losing control. It was about something deeper. The meeting in North Carolina wasn't just political, it was personal. And that made it more dangerous. The walls around him seemed to close in. He needed to make a decision. But what decision would that be? For now, all he could do was turn on his heel, pacing across the cabin in frustration, trying to collect his thoughts, to grasp the fleeting sense of control he thought he still had. His mind was clouded, emotions bubbling up in a torrent of anger and humiliation. He had been rejected, exposed, and the weight of it sat heavy in his chest. As Rhodes stepped back, his posture still perfect, his expression still calm, Grant was left in the silence of his own mind, the echoes of his own rage ringing in his ears. The consequences of this moment had only just begun to unfold. And he couldn't help but wonder, was this the start of something far bigger than anyone could have anticipated? The seconds dragged on, stretching into an eternity for Grant. His breath came in sharp, controlled bursts, each exhale a battle to maintain his composure. As he moved through the narrow aisles of the plane, his footsteps echoed in his mind, loud against the silence that hung thick in the cabin. His anger, once an explosive force, now simmered beneath the surface, coiling into something darker, more dangerous. He couldn't let this go, he wouldn't let it. The defiance of Captain Rhodes had struck him deep, and it gnawed at him with an intensity he hadn't expected. Grant had always prided himself on control, on being the one who called the shots. Yet, in the face of Rhodes' unwavering stance, he felt a crack form in that carefully constructed facade. His hand gripped the armrest as he passed, a reflex to steady himself, to hold on to something that could anchor him in a world where things were beginning to slip. He could feel the tightness in his chest, a weight pressing on him that had nothing to do with the physical demands of the situation. No, it was the suffocating realization that he was not as untouchable as he once believed. His power, the one thing he had built his entire identity upon, was slipping through his fingers. The thought made his heart race, each beat louder than the last, until it threatened to drown out everything else. When he reached the cockpit, he didn't hesitate, he couldn't. The door swung open in response to his forceful knock, and there they were, the two pilots, faces caught between professionalism and uncertainty. The younger co-pilot looked at him with a trace of fear in his eyes, while Rhodes stood firm behind the controls, unflinching. The calmness in his demeanor only made Grant's pulse quicken further. How could he be so calm? Didn't he realize what was at stake here? Didn't he see the absolute power Grant still wielded, even in this moment of crisis? Grant's voice was sharp, cutting through the silence of the cockpit. "You're making a huge mistake, Rhodes," he spat, his words dripping with disdain. The anger surged again, filling his throat with heat. "This is bigger than you. This is bigger than all of us. What you're doing here, defying me in front of everyone, it's not just insubordination. It's a challenge. And I won't tolerate it." Rhodes didn't flinch, didn't even move a muscle. His expression remained calm, almost too calm, as if the chaos surrounding them was irrelevant to him. There was something almost maddening about it, that air of unshakable resolve, the way he stood there as if he knew the truth of the situation better than anyone else. It enraged Grant further. He had spent so many years shaping his world, constructing a reality where his decisions were final. But here, in this moment, Rhodes was threatening to unravel all of that with nothing more than his quiet defiance. "I'm not making a mistake, sir," Rhodes replied, his voice steady, but tinged with the hint of something far more dangerous, certainty. "This is not about who's right or wrong in some power struggle. This is about the safety of everyone on this plane. This isn't some game where we can afford to take risks just because you're frustrated or feel like your authority is being challenged. This is real life." The words hit Grant like a slap, and for a brief second, his anger faltered. Rhodes' gaze was unwavering, his eyes not just meeting his but piercing through him, challenging him to see beyond his own inflated sense of self. It was almost as if Rhodes could see right into the cracks in Grant's psyche, the raw fear he was desperately trying to hide beneath his mask of control. The reality of it, the enormity of the situation, was starting to settle in. This wasn't just about a political power play. This was about the lives of hundreds of people, innocent people who had nothing to do with the petty games he was playing. Do you really believe you're the only one who knows what's at stake here? Rhodes continued, his tone quieter now, but no less firm. You've put everything on the line for what? For control? For power? I've seen how this system works, and it's broken, Mr. President. The people on this plane, they deserve better than this. And I won't put them in danger just because you've decided this is what's best. Grant's heart thudded painfully in his chest, the sharpness of the words cutting through the layers of pride and arrogance he had built up over the years. There was something in Rhodes' voice that made him feel smaller, more vulnerable than he ever had before. It was the truth, raw and unfiltered, and it rattled him in a way he hadn't anticipated. He could feel his grip on control slipping faster than he could hold on. For a moment, the anger began to fade, replaced by something else. Something he hadn't expected to feel. Doubt. Self-doubt. The voice in his head, the one that had always guided him with unwavering certainty, suddenly felt unsure. Was he really doing the right thing? Was this really about protecting the country? Or was it about something far more selfish, something he didn't want to admit, even to himself? But no. He couldn't back down now. The stakes were too high. His mind scrambled to find something, anything, that would help him reassert control over the situation. He was the president. The world was watching. He couldn't let a single moment of weakness slip through his fingers, not in front of Rhodes, not in front of anyone. His voice was low, barely a whisper of what it had been before. You don't understand, he said, the words heavy with the weight of something he didn't want to admit. You don't know what's at stake. What I'm doing, it's for the greater good. You may not see it now, but in time, you will. This is bigger than us. I have to push forward. Rhodes watched him, his eyes steady, unblinking, as if he could see right through Grant's attempt at deflection. If this is about the greater good, Mr. President, then why does it feel like it's all about your own ego? I'm not afraid to stand up to you, because I know I'm doing the right thing. And that's what matters. Right now, it's not about power, it's about humanity. Grant took a step back, the weight of Rhodes' words sinking in deeper than he was willing to acknowledge. There was a long, tense silence between them, a chasm of unspoken truths and unresolved tension. Grant wanted to scream, to lash out, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he just nodded, his shoulders heavy with the realization that this fight was far from over, but for now, the battle had shifted. Get me back on course, he said finally, his voice barely a whisper, as though the words themselves carried the weight of his defeat. He turned away, unwilling to face the man who had just broken through his defenses, who had made him question everything he thought he knew about himself. As Rhodes silently returned to the controls, the tension in the cockpit remained thick, the air heavy with unspoken understanding. The plane surged forward, but neither Grant nor Rhodes would be the same by the time they reached their destination. The low hum of the aircraft's engines filled the cabin, but Grant barely noticed it anymore. He was lost in his thoughts, staring absently at the faint glow of the overhead lights. It was a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside him, a tempest of doubt and frustration that seemed to intensify with every passing minute. The decisions he had made earlier, the ones he had once been so sure of, now felt like cracks in the foundation of everything he had built. He gripped the armrest in front of him so tightly his fingers ached, but the physical sensation barely registered. He was consumed by a whirlwind of emotions. The weight of responsibility, the fear of losing control, and, worst of all, the unsettling realization that maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong. The certainty that had always guided him was now an illusion, and the longer he tried to hold on to it, the more it slipped through his fingers. His mind kept returning to the conversation he'd had with Rhodes earlier. He hadn't expected the young man to challenge him so directly, to cut through his carefully constructed defenses with such quiet precision. "This is bigger than you," Rhodes had said, and those words haunted him. They echoed in his mind like a drumbeat, reminding him that this wasn't just a power struggle, but a fight for something more profound. Was he doing this for the greater good? Was he truly acting in the best interest of everyone on board, or was he blinded by the need to maintain control, to prove that he was the one who had all the answers? The more he thought about it, the more he felt like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, staring into the unknown. His eyes shifted toward the small window beside him, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to lose focus, watching the endless expanse of clouds below. The sunset was beginning to spill its colors across the horizon, but Grant saw none of the beauty. He was too consumed by the knot tightening in his chest. The vast sky outside seemed like a mirror of his mind, boundless, chaotic, and full of uncertainties. The dark clouds gathered, swirling ominously, and for the first time, he couldn't help but feel like they were a reflection of the storm brewing inside him. His hand tightened around the armrest, his nails digging into the leather, but it wasn't enough to calm the turmoil that surged within him. He was a man who had always thrived on control, who had made decisions that shaped the lives of others without a second thought. And yet, here he was, questioning every choice he had ever made. How had he allowed himself to get to this point? How had he allowed his own ego, his own sense of authority, to blind him to the truth? The voice of his inner doubt was relentless, growing louder with every passing moment. But before he could spiral further into his self-doubt, a sound broke through his thoughts, a soft, almost imperceptible creak of the cockpit door. He turned, his heart momentarily skipping a beat, and saw Rhodes standing there. The young pilot's expression was unreadable, but there was a calmness about him that made Grant's own anxiety feel even more pronounced. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence hung between them like a heavy fog, and Grant felt a knot tighten in his stomach. It was as if the entire world had paused, holding its breath, waiting for something, anything, to break the tension. Rhodes stepped forward, his movements deliberate and controlled. There was no fear in his eyes, no hesitation. Just an unshakable resolve. It was as though he had already accepted the weight of the situation and was simply waiting for Grant to catch up. "We need to talk," Rhodes said, his voice soft but firm, like the calm before a storm. Grant wanted to lash out, to tell him that there was nothing more to discuss, that the decisions had been made and there was no turning back. But the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he simply nodded, the gesture almost mechanical, as if his body was acting on instinct, while his mind struggled to catch up. "What is it?" Grant asked, his voice rough, a trace of frustration leaking through. He couldn't keep the edge out of his tone, no matter how hard he tried. It was as if the tension had built up inside him, and now it was threatening to explode. Rhodes didn't flinch. He didn't back away, either. Instead, he took another step closer, his gaze unwavering. "I know you're struggling with this. I can see it. You're not the man who's used to questioning himself. But this situation, it's different. It's not just about us. It's about everyone on this plane. We can't let personal pride get in the way of making the right decision." Grant felt his heart pound in his chest. The words felt like a punch to the gut, sharp and unexpected. He had never liked being challenged, especially not in front of others, especially not by someone younger than him. But there was something about Rhodes, something in the calmness of his voice, the way he held himself, that disarmed Grant in a way he wasn't prepared for. "This isn't about pride," Grant shot back, but even as he said it, he felt the words ring hollow. He had spent his career fighting for power, making decisions that placed him above others, and now, for the first time, he wasn't sure if that was the right path anymore. "This is about the bigger picture. I've spent my life ensuring that this country, this mission, stays intact. I can't just throw that away." "I know," Rhodes said quietly. "But sometimes, Grant, holding on too tightly to what we think we know blinds us to what's actually important. It's not about being right, it's about doing what's right." Grant's eyes narrowed as he absorbed the weight of the words. They were simple, yet profound. He had been so focused on maintaining control, on sticking to his plan, that he hadn't stopped to consider the bigger picture. Rhodes had a point. A painful, undeniable point. For a long moment, the two men stood there, locked in a silent standoff. The plane continued its flight, steady and unyielding, as if unaware of the storm raging within the hearts of its passengers. And in that moment, Grant realized something he hadn't wanted to admit: he didn't have all the answers. He never had. He exhaled slowly, his fingers loosening their grip on the armrest. The anger, the pride, the need to dominate, all of it began to fade, replaced by something more vulnerable. Something he hadn't felt in years. "Maybe you're right," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper, the words leaving his mouth as if they had to fight their way out. "Maybe it's time I started listening to the people around me." Rhodes offered a small, knowing nod, his expression softening. "It's never easy, Grant. But it's the only way forward." Grant turned his gaze back to the window, his mind spinning. The storm outside had grown stronger, the winds whipping the clouds into chaotic patterns. Yet, within him, something had shifted. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him question everything. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope, a hope that perhaps, just perhaps, he could find a way to lead without losing himself in the process. The airplane was still, save for the occasional low rumble of thunder in the distance. The evening had descended into a thick darkness, the sky outside now a tumult of swirling clouds and flickering lightning. The atmosphere inside the cabin, however, felt heavy with something more than just the approaching storm. It was as though a great weight had settled over Grant's chest, suffocating him, urging him to make a decision he was still too afraid to confront. Grant sat back in his seat, his fingers absently tapping on the armrest, as if the movement could somehow keep his racing thoughts in check. His mind refused to settle. He kept replaying the same set of questions over and over: what went wrong, where he had miscalculated, and most urgently, what he was supposed to do next. The familiar urge to control every aspect of the situation tugged at him, but deep down, he knew that controlling this was beyond his power. The realization was unsettling, as though the very foundation of everything he had believed in was crumbling under his feet. His eyes flickered to Rhodes, who sat beside him, leaning against the window, his posture relaxed yet steady. Rhodes had always been the quieter one, the one who waited for the right moments to speak, never rushing or pushing, qualities that Grant had always admired in the younger man, yet never fully understood. To Grant, every moment had always been about action, about seizing control, making things happen. But Rhodes, in his calm, almost detached way, seemed to understand that sometimes, the best thing to do was simply wait. Grant's gaze lingered on him, trying to read the unreadable. Rhodes had known from the start that this moment would come. That Grant would eventually reach a breaking point where his need for control would be tested to the limits. But Rhodes said nothing, offering only a silent, unspoken support, as if giving Grant the space to come to terms with his own struggle. "Rhodes," Grant finally spoke, his voice strained, almost apologetic, "I've spent my whole life thinking that the only way to survive, to win, was to control everything around me. Every decision, every move, I had to be the one pulling the strings. And it worked, for a time. It worked because I made it work. But now... His voice trailed off, the words heavy in the air between them, as if they were too difficult to put into words. The realization, as sharp as it was, gnawed at him. I'm starting to think that all this time, I've been doing it all wrong. Rhodes turned his head slightly, his gaze steady but not judgmental. There was no shock in his eyes, no need to rush in with words of reassurance. He simply waited, his silence inviting Grant to continue without pressure. The air between them was thick with expectation, but it wasn't the kind of pressure that suffocated, rather, it was the kind of silence that gave room for clarity, for thought, for self-realization. I thought I could control it, Grant muttered, rubbing his hand over his face in frustration. Control the people around me, the mission, the outcome. I thought that if I held on tight enough, if I did everything by the book, I could keep things from falling apart. But now I can see how fragile that all is. How easily it all crumbles when the pieces start moving outside of my grasp. There was a tremor in his voice, not of fear, but of something deeper, a dawning vulnerability that Grant had never allowed himself to acknowledge before. He had spent so many years building walls around his emotions, around his vulnerabilities. He couldn't afford to show weakness, not when he was the one people relied on. But now, in the face of this crisis, he felt exposed. And for the first time in a long time, the vulnerability was not a sign of failure, it was a sign of something more human, more real. Rhodes's expression remained calm, but his eyes softened. It was clear to him that Grant was not just talking about the mission, he was talking about something much deeper. This wasn't just a man grappling with a professional decision, it was a man struggling with his own identity, his own need to control everything in his life. And Rhodes knew, without a doubt, that this was a pivotal moment. If Grant could embrace this vulnerability, if he could let go of his need to control the uncontrollable, it would change everything. You can't control everything, Grant, Rhodes said quietly, his voice low but steady. You never could. The best you can do is make the right choices when it matters the most. And trust the people around you to do the same. Grant turned toward him, a flicker of something almost like understanding crossing his face. Trust, he repeated, as though the word itself was foreign to him. I don't know if I know how to trust anymore. It's not about knowing, Rhodes replied, his voice calm but firm. It's about letting go of the fear that you're going to lose everything. Because the truth is, if you keep holding on so tightly, you might lose everything anyway. But if you trust, if you let go just enough, you might be able to find a way through this. Together. The words hit Grant like a wave, knocking the breath from his chest. He had always prided himself on being a solitary force, someone who didn't need anyone else, who didn't have to rely on others. But now, in the face of everything he had worked for, everything that was slipping out of his control, he was beginning to see the cracks in that armor. Maybe Rhodes was right. Maybe it was time to stop trying to be the one who held everything together. Grant's gaze flickered to the cockpit door, and he found himself standing before he even realized it. He had come to a decision, one that felt right, even if it was uncomfortable. It wasn't about having all the answers. It was about moving forward, knowing that he couldn't do this alone. I'll call the team in, Grant said, his voice firmer now. The doubt that had plagued him earlier was still there, but it no longer had a grip on him. We'll make the decision together. Not just me. All of us. Rhodes watched him, his expression almost unreadable, but the subtle nod of his head acknowledged the shift that had taken place. He had been right all along. Grant was no longer the man who needed to control everything. He was the man who had learned that sometimes, letting go was the strongest thing he could do. As Grant walked toward the cockpit, he felt something inside him shift, something lighter, less burdened. The storm outside raged on, but in that moment, he realized that the real storm had been inside him all along. And for the first time, he was willing to face it head-on, with the trust of others by his side. Captain Rhodes didn't see himself as a hero. He didn't write a book, go on a media tour, or seek applause. He returned to quiet halls and classrooms, teaching future officers about integrity, not with grand speeches, but through the weight of lived experience. And yet, the world remembers. In a time when whispers of power often drown out the voice of reason, one quiet refusal soared above them all. His decision in that pressurized cabin became a ripple in American history, a reminder that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes, it speaks in calm defiance. Sometimes, it wears a uniform. Sometimes, it simply says, "I can't comply." Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, leave a comment, share your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories where truth meets tension, and principle defies power.